The candle on the bedside table had burned down to a miserable stub, and Duke Julian Ashworth could not remember the last time he had the strength to replace it himself. 3 months. That is how long he had been dying. Or at least, that is what everyone around him believed. The physician, Dr. Hartwell, had declared it a wasting disease of the blood, something inherited, something unavoidable, something that would take him quietly before autumn turned to winter. His 2 younger brothers, Edmund and Lionel, had already begun wearing dark colors to dinner, as though rehearsing for the funeral. Julian lay propped against 4 goose-feather pillows in his enormous bedchamber at Highcliffe Manor, staring at the plaster ceiling where painted cherubs floated among faded clouds. His coastal estate sat on the chalk cliffs of Dorset, and on quiet nights like this one, he could hear the sea grinding against the rocks far below. It was a sound that had comforted him since boyhood. Tonight, it sounded like the earth slowly swallowing something whole. He was 31 years old and weighed less than he had at 16. His hands, resting on the embroidered coverlet, were thin enough to see the veins running blue beneath the skin. Every evening, Dr. Hartwell mixed him a tonic, a brownish liquid with a bitter herbal taste, and every morning, Julian woke feeling worse than the night before. His legs trembled when he tried to stand. His vision blurred without warning. Food tasted like copper pennies. He had signed nothing yet. That was the one matter still dangling. His solicitor, Mr. Pembroke, had drawn up a new will 2 weeks ago, one that would convert a large portion of the Ashworth lands into a public charitable trust rather than passing everything to Edmund and Lionel. Julian had intended to sign it on Monday last, but a terrible bout of vomiting had delayed the appointment. Then again on Wednesday, then again on Friday. Each time, his brothers had stood outside his door with long, concerned faces, whispering to Dr. Hartwell about whether their poor elder brother was fit to handle legal affairs in such a fragile condition. Julian was beginning to wonder if his body was betraying him, or if something else entirely was happening. The clock in the corridor struck 11:30. His chamber door opened slowly, and a figure slipped inside, carrying a brass candle snuffer and a small tray. Julian recognized the silhouette, the new scullery maid, hired only a fortnight ago to replace old Mrs. Denny, who had retired to her daughter's cottage in the village. The girl was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with dark hair pinned tightly beneath a plain linen cap. She wore the standard gray dress and white apron of the household staff, and she moved with a strange kind of deliberate calm that Julian had noticed before. Most servants in a dying man's room either rushed through their duties or lingered with pity. This one did neither. Her name was Clara. She set the tray down on the side table and began snuffing the smaller candles along the mantelpiece, one by one. Julian watched her through half-closed eyes. He had learned, during these long weeks of illness, to observe people carefully, since observation was the only activity his body still permitted. Clara reached the candle nearest his bed, and then she did something peculiar. Instead of snuffing it, she leaned down, close enough that he could smell soap and wood smoke on her collar, and she whispered 5 words that drove every trace of drowsiness from his mind. "Your evening tonic is poison." Julian's eyes opened fully. His breath caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. Clara did not look at him. She continued adjusting the candlestick as though inspecting the wax, her voice barely louder than the draft slipping beneath the window frame. "Your guards have been paid off, both of them. Your brothers arranged it through Dr. Hartwell. The tonic he gives you each evening contains arsenic, small amounts, mixed with valerian and honey to mask the taste. You have been taking it for weeks. That is why you are dying, Your Grace." You are not ill. You are being finished. Julian tried to speak, but his voice cracked. He swallowed hard and managed a rough whisper. Who are you? Someone who was placed in this house to find exactly this kind of evidence. Clara's hands moved to the coverlet, straightening it with the casual efficiency of a servant performing a routine task. There is no time to explain further. Your brothers expect you to be gone by morning, before Mr. Pembroke arrives with the will for signing. The 2 guards outside your door will ensure that no one enters and no one leaves. At midnight, the guard rotation changes, and for approximately 4 minutes, the east corridor will be unwatched. She paused. Her dark eyes met his for the first time, and there was something fierce and sharp behind them, an intelligence that did not belong to a scullery maid. There is a service door behind the pantry on the ground floor. It leads to a stone staircase cut into the cliffs. I have a rowboat at the cove below. If you can walk, I can get you out. Julian stared at her. His mind, foggy as it had been for weeks, was suddenly working with a desperate clarity. Everything she said answered questions that had been circling in his head like trapped birds. The strange metallic taste, the timing of his worst episodes, the way Edmund and Lionel always seemed to be nearby whenever Mr. Pembroke attempted to visit. "Why should I trust you?" he asked. It was the obvious question. A stranger appears in the dark and tells you to abandon your own home. A reasonable man would hesitate. Clara reached into her apron pocket and placed a small glass vial on his pillow. It contained the remains of a brownish liquid. That is tonight's tonic, the one Dr. Hartwell left for you. I poured it from your cup before you woke from your nap and replaced it with cold chamomile tea. If I am lying, drink the original and stay in your bed. If I am telling the truth, you have less than 25 minutes to decide whether you would like to be alive tomorrow. The clock in the corridor ticked. The sea murmured against the cliffs. Somewhere in the house, a door closed softly. Julian looked at the vial, then at Clara, then at his own wasted hands. He pushed the coverlet aside. "Help me stand," he said. Standing was worse than Julian had imagined. His legs buckled the moment his bare feet touched the cold oak floorboards, and Clara caught him under the arm, with a grip far stronger than her frame suggested. She had clearly anticipated this. Without a word, she pulled a wool overcoat from the chair beside the wardrobe and draped it across his shoulders, then handed him a pair of worn leather boots that were not his own. "Whose are these?" he murmured. "The gardener's. Yours would make noise on the stone steps. These have soft soles." Julian pushed his feet into the boots. They were a size too large, but comfort was not the priority tonight. Clara moved to the chamber door and pressed her ear against it. Julian could hear the low murmur of conversation from the other side. His 2 personal guards, Reynolds and Thatcher, men he had trusted for the better part of 3 years. Men who had carried him to the bathing room when his legs failed last month. Men who had apparently been bought for a price he would very much like to know, if he survived long enough to ask. Clara held up her hand. Wait. Footsteps moved past the door. A floorboard groaned. Then silence. She turned back to him and pointed toward the far corner of the bedchamber, where a servant's passage was concealed behind a section of oak paneling. Julian knew about this passage. Every Ashworth child had played in the house's hidden corridors during childhood, but he had forgotten how narrow it was. Clara slid the panel aside, revealing a dark gap barely wide enough for one person to pass through sideways. "After you, Your Grace." Julian entered the passage. The air inside was stale and thick with dust. Cobwebs dragged across his face. Clara followed and eased the panel shut behind them, plunging them into absolute darkness. Then a small flame appeared. She had struck a match, and lit a tallow candle no thicker than her finger. "We go down to the ground floor, through the old wine cellar, and into the pantry corridor," she whispered. "From the pantry, the service door opens onto the cliff stairs. Do not speak above a whisper, and if you need to stop, squeeze my shoulder." Julian nodded. His heart was hammering in a way it had not hammered in months. Whether that was fear or the first stirring of genuine life returning to his poisoned body, he could not tell. They descended a cramped wooden staircase that spiraled between the walls of the house. Julian remembered sliding down these steps on a cushion when he was 8 years old, laughing while his mother called after him from the upper landing. That memory felt like it belonged to a different man entirely. His hand pressed against the rough plaster wall for balance, and twice his knees nearly gave way. But Clara was always there, half a step ahead, glancing back, adjusting her pace to match his failing strength. The wine cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth and old oak barrels. They crossed it quickly, stepping over a puddle of something Julian chose not to examine. The pantry corridor beyond was narrow and lined with shelves of preserving jars and hanging dried herbs. At the far end, a low wooden door sat flush with the wall, secured by a single iron bolt. Clara slid the bolt back. The door swung outward, and the night rushed in. Salt air, wet stone, and the deep rhythmic thunder of waves striking rock. Julian stepped through and immediately understood why this exit had been forgotten by the household. The path beyond was carved directly into the chalk cliff face, a series of rough, uneven steps barely 2 feet wide, descending at a sharp angle toward the shoreline far below. There was no railing. To the left, the cliff wall rose vertically. To the right, there was nothing except darkness and the sound of the sea. "Stay close to the wall," Clara said. "The steps are damp from the spray. Place each foot flat before you shift your weight." They began the descent. Julian's legs shook with every step, and the salt wind pulled at his overcoat with greedy fingers. Halfway down, he looked up and saw the faint glow of lanterns moving along the cliff path above. The patrol. 2 lights swinging in slow arcs, methodical, bored, completely unaware that their quarry was 30 feet below them on a staircase that no one in the household had used in a generation. Clara stopped. She pressed Julian against the cliff wall and covered the candle flame with her cupped hand. They stood motionless while the lantern light passed overhead, casting long amber streaks across the chalk face. Julian could hear the guards' voices, fragments tossed about by the wind. "Check the chamber at 1:15. Hartwell says by morning, no later." Edmund promised 40 guineas each when it's settled. 40 guineas. That was the price of a duke's life, apparently. Julian filed that number away in a compartment of his mind where anger was beginning to build, slow and deliberate, like coals arranged in a grate. The lanterns moved on. Clara released the candle flame, and they continued downward. The final stretch of the staircase ended at a rocky shelf just above the waterline. The cove was small and sheltered, hemmed in by tall chalk formations that blocked the view from above. A wooden rowboat sat pulled halfway onto the rocks, its oars already set in the locks. Clara had prepared this in advance, which told Julian that she had known about tonight's danger for some time before choosing to act. She helped him into the boat, and his weight made the hull scrape against the stones. Then she pushed off and climbed in after him, taking the oars with a practiced efficiency that surprised him. For a scullery maid, she rowed like someone who had spent considerable time on the water. The fog was thick across the cove, and within 20 strokes, Highcliffe Manor had vanished entirely behind a wall of gray mist. Julian sat in the stern, wrapped in the gardener's coat, trembling from cold and exertion and the slow, awful understanding of what his own brothers had done to him. Behind them, faintly, carried across the water like a ghost of sound, he heard shouting, doors slamming. The commotion had begun. They had discovered his empty bed. Clara rowed harder, her breath steady, her jaw set. The little boat cut through the dark water toward an invisible shoreline where a fisherman's abandoned hut waited in silence. Julian gripped the gunwale with his thin fingers and stared back into the fog where his home had disappeared. He would return. He was certain of that now. Whatever strength remained in his ruined body, whatever it cost him, he would return to Highcliffe Manor, and when he did, he would not be arriving as an invalid. The fisherman's hut had kept them hidden for 2 days, but it was no place for a man whose body was still carrying poison. The walls were rotting timber, the roof leaked in 3 places, and the only warmth came from a small iron brazier that Clara fed with driftwood she collected along the shore before dawn each morning. Julian spent most of those first 48 hours sleeping on a straw pallet, waking only to drink the boiled water Clara insisted he take every few hours. On the 3rd morning, she told him they had to move. "The cove is too close to the estate," she said, kneeling beside him and pressing the back of her hand to his forehead. "Your brothers will send men along the shoreline once they realize you did not drown. There is a place I know, a cottage in the salt marshes, about 9 miles inland. We can reach it by nightfall if we start now." Julian sat up. The room tilted slightly, then steadied. 9 miles, he repeated. 3 months ago, he could have ridden that distance in under an hour. Now, the thought of walking it made his stomach clench. "I will manage the pace," Clara said, as though reading the calculation behind his eyes. "There are hedgerows and drainage ditches most of the way. Good cover. We stay off the roads entirely." They left the hut as the tide was going out, picking their way across the wet rocks and up a sheep trail that wound through gorse bushes and low scrub. The morning was gray and overcast, which suited them perfectly. 2 figures moving across open marshland would be invisible at any distance beyond a 1/4 mile in this weather. The walk took the entire day. They stopped frequently, behind a fallen oak, inside a derelict sheep pen, once in the hollow of a dried stream bed where Julian lay on his back and stared at the sky while his legs recovered enough feeling to continue. Clara never rushed him, never showed impatience, but she never allowed him to rest longer than was strictly necessary either. There was a discipline in her manner that Julian had seen before, though usually in military officers rather than household servants. By late afternoon, the landscape had changed. The firm ground gave way to soft, waterlogged earth, and the air carried a sharp mineral smell, salt and peat, and something faintly sulphurous. Reeds grew taller than a man's head, in dense walls on either side of narrow footpaths that seemed to lead nowhere. Clara navigated this maze without hesitation, stepping over hidden channels of brackish water and skirting patches of ground that looked solid but clearly were not. The cottage appeared so suddenly that Julian almost walked past it. It was built of gray stone, half buried in a mound of earth and overgrown with marsh grass, so that from any distance it resembled nothing more than a natural hillock. A single chimney poked up from the thatched roof, and the door was so low that even Clara had to duck to enter. Inside, it was surprisingly dry. The floor was packed earth, covered with rushes, a wooden table, 2 stools, a narrow cot, and a fireplace with a blackened cooking pot comprised the entire furnishings. But the walls were thick, the thatch was sound, and the marshes around it would swallow any approaching footsteps long before a stranger could arrive unannounced. "Whose cottage is this?" Julian asked, lowering himself onto the cot with the careful movements of an old man. "It belonged to a wildfowler who died last winter. No one has claimed it. The marsh folk avoid this stretch because the ground is treacherous." Clara was already building a fire, her hands moving with quick competence. "Which makes it perfect for us." Once the fire was burning and Julian had eaten a small meal of hard cheese and bread that Clara had carried in a cloth sack from the hut, she sat across from him and placed several small glass vials on the table between them. Julian recognized them immediately. They were from his bedchamber, the tonic bottles that Dr. Hartwell prepared each evening. "You took these from the manor?" he asked. "I collected them over the course of my first week in the household." Dr. Hartwell disposed of the empty vials in the kitchen waste. "No one pays attention to what a scullery maid handles." Clara uncorked one of the vials and held it to the firelight. A thin residue of brownish liquid clung to the glass. "Your Grace, I must be direct with you about something. My name is Clara Sterling, and I am not a maid. I am an investigator attached to the county magistrate's office in Exeter. I was placed in your household after an anonymous letter reached the magistrate suggesting that foul dealings were occurring at Highcliffe Manor." Julian absorbed this quietly. Part of him had already suspected something along these lines. No scullery maid carried lockpicks in her apron pocket, and no kitchen servant could identify a poison by its residue. "The symptoms you have been suffering," Clara continued, tilting the vial slowly, "are consistent with prolonged arsenic exposure, administered in small, regular doses. The metallic taste in your mouth, the weakness in your limbs, the episodes of severe nausea, these are characteristic markers. Dr. Hartwell has been feeding you measured quantities mixed into a base of valerian root and honey, enough to weaken you gradually over weeks, allowing your decline to appear natural. And my brothers instructed this. The evidence strongly suggests it. I have observed both Mr. Edmund and Mr. Lionel Ashworth meeting privately with Dr. Hartwell on multiple occasions, always after dark, always in the study, with the door locked." Clara set the vial down. "However, I was removed from the household before I could obtain direct written proof. The ledgers, the correspondence, those are still at the manor, or with the brothers' associates." Julian looked at his hands. The tremor was still there, a faint vibration running through his fingers, like a plucked string. "What do we do about the poison? Already inside me?" "That is our first concern." Clara reached into her coat and produced a small leather pouch. "There is an herbalist who lives on the far edge of these marshes, a woman named Mrs. Cathcart. She is reclusive and eccentric, but she is knowledgeable in botanical remedies. I intend to visit her tomorrow and obtain a preparation of charcoal and specific herbs that will help draw the remaining arsenic from your body." "And the price?" Clara hesitated for the first time since Julian had known her. She touched the collar of her dress, where a thin silver chain disappeared beneath the fabric. "I have something she will accept." The following morning, Clara left before sunrise. She returned 3 hours later, carrying a stoppered clay jar filled with a thick, dark paste that smelled of charcoal, ground milk thistle, and something sharply bitter that Julian could not identify. Mrs. Cathcart's remedy. The silver chain was gone from Clara's neck. Julian noticed, but said nothing. He took the first dose that afternoon, mixed into warm water, and within hours, his body began to purge itself with a violence that left him gasping on the cot. Clara stayed beside him through all of it, replacing damp cloths on his forehead and ensuring he continued drinking clean water between each episode. By evening, for the first time in months, the metallic taste in his mouth had faded. 2 days of Mrs. Cathcart's remedy had emptied Julian's body of something foul and persistent. And on the 5th morning since his escape from Highcliffe, he woke with a sensation he had almost forgotten: hunger. Genuine, demanding hunger, the kind that made his stomach tighten and his mouth water at the smell of the oatcakes Clara was toasting over the fire. He ate 3 of them, with a slice of cured ham she had purchased from a marsh farmer the previous afternoon, and when he finished, he asked for more. Clara watched him eat with an expression that was difficult to read. Relief, certainly. Perhaps something close to satisfaction, the way a carpenter might regard a fractured beam that was beginning to hold weight again. "We cannot stay here much longer," she said, handing him a cup of brewed nettle tea. "The marshes are safe, but isolation works against us. Your brothers will be consolidating their position. Every day we remain hidden is a day they use to build their claim that you are dead. What do you suggest?" Oakhaven. It is a coaching village, about 12 miles northeast, on the road between Dorchester and Yeovil. Busy enough to disappear into, small enough that we can monitor who passes through. There is a posting in there where mail coaches stop twice daily. Clara folded her hands on the table. "If your brothers are communicating with their solicitors or with Dr. Hartwell by letter, the correspondence will pass through that inn." Julian considered this. His mind was working more clearly than it had in weeks, and he found that he could follow threads of reasoning without the fog that had plagued him throughout his illness. The arsenic had dulled his thinking as thoroughly as it had weakened his body. Now, with the poison drawing out of his system, thoughts arrived sharp and complete. "We cannot travel as ourselves," he said. "Agreed. I have given this some thought." Clara produced 2 sets of clothing from a canvas bag she had acquired from somewhere Julian had not bothered to ask about. For herself, a plain brown traveling dress with a modest bonnet, the kind worn by the sister or daughter of a middling tradesman. For Julian, a simple dark coat, a linen shirt without collar points, a waistcoat of common wool, and a flat cap that no gentleman would be seen wearing within 50 miles of London. "You are Mr. James Hale, a clerk employed by a cloth merchant in Bridport," Clara told him. "I am your sister, Miss Catherine Hale. We are traveling to visit a cousin in Sherborne. Keep your speech plain and avoid discussing anything that reveals your education. If anyone asks about your thin appearance, you have been recovering from a chest fever." Julian held up the flat cap and turned it over in his hands. He had worn silk top hats and beaver-skin riding caps his entire adult life. This object looked like something a stable hand might lose in a ditch without troubling himself to retrieve it. "Vanity is a luxury for men who are not being hunted, Your Grace," Clara said, and Julian thought he detected the faintest trace of amusement at the corner of her mouth. They left the marshland cottage that afternoon, following drovers' paths through farmland until they reached a proper lane. Julian's legs were still unreliable over uneven ground, but on the flat, packed earth of the road, he found he could walk at a reasonable pace without stopping. His appetite had returned, and with it, a thin current of energy that made the 12-mile journey difficult rather than impossible. They reached Oakhaven shortly before dusk. The village was exactly as Clara had described, a modest cluster of stone and timber buildings arranged along a crossroads, dominated by the coaching inn, which bore the name The White Hart above its arched entrance. Coaches from 3 directions passed through, daily, and the yard was busy with ostlers, passengers, and commercial travelers conducting their affairs over ale and cold supper. Clara arranged lodging at a smaller establishment across the road, a widow's boarding house that let rooms by the week and asked few questions. Julian was installed in a small but clean upstairs room with a proper bed, a washstand, and a window overlooking the high street. He sat on the bed and felt the mattress give beneath him and the simple comfort of it nearly undid him. He slept for 14 hours. When he woke the following morning, Clara was already gone. She had left a note on the washstand in small, precise handwriting. "Remain indoors. Eat the breakfast the landlady brings. I will return by midday." Julian did as instructed, though the obedience chafed him. He was accustomed to giving orders and receiving them from a woman half his age who had been scrubbing his kitchen floors a week ago, required a deliberate adjustment of pride. He ate the breakfast, boiled eggs, toast, and strong tea, and found that his hands were steadier than yesterday. The tremor had not vanished entirely, but it had retreated to something barely perceptible. Clara returned at 11:30, carrying a leather satchel that was not hers. She locked the door behind her, drew the curtains, and sat down opposite Julian with the satchel between them on the narrow table. "The posting inn receives courier bags for collection every morning," she said. "This bag was marked for a Mr. L. Ashworth, to be held until called for. Your brother Lionel, I assume. You stole a courier bag from a public posting inn. I borrowed it. The innkeeper steps out to the yard when the morning coach arrives. The sorting shelf is behind the counter and unattended for approximately 3 minutes. I will return the bag before the afternoon coach." Clara unbuckled the satchel and began removing its contents. "But first, you should see what your brothers have been writing." There were 6 documents inside. Julian spread them across the table and read each one with the slow, careful attention of a man discovering the architecture of his own destruction. The first 2 were letters between Edmund and a solicitor in Dorchester, someone other than the family attorney, Mr. Pembroke, outlining the division of the ducal estates into 2 equal shares. Highcliffe Manor and its farmlands to Edmund, the London townhouse and the northern properties to Lionel. The charitable trust that Julian had planned was mentioned only once, in a marginal note in Edmund's handwriting. This provision to be struck entirely upon confirmation of incapacity or death. The third document was a draft declaration of mental incompetence, prepared for submission to the county court, stating that Duke Julian Ashworth was of unsound mind and unfit to manage his own affairs. The fourth and fifth were financial receipts, payments of various sums to Dr. Hartwell, to Reynolds and Thatcher, and to 2 other names Julian did not recognize. Each receipt was written in Dr. Hartwell's distinctive slanted hand and marked with dates corresponding precisely to the weeks of Julian's worst decline. The 6th document was a letter from Dr. Hartwell to Edmund, dated 3 days before Clara's midnight warning. Julian read it twice. The relevant passage was brief and clinical. The current dosage should produce the desired conclusion within the week. I recommend no visitors be permitted during the final stage, as the subject's appearance may raise questions among those unfamiliar with the progression of consumptive illness. Julian set the letter down. His hands were shaking again, though this time it had nothing to do with poison. "We keep every page," he said quietly. "Every single page." 3 more days passed at the widow's boarding house in Oakhaven, and each morning Julian woke feeling as though a layer of heavy cloth had been peeled away from his senses. The charcoal remedy was doing its work. His appetite, which had returned as a tentative visitor on the 5th day, had now settled in permanently and was making demands. He ate everything the landlady brought him: mutton broth, bread with dripping, boiled potatoes, stewed apples, and asked for second helpings without embarrassment. His body was responding. The hollows beneath his cheekbones began to fill. The bruised color under his eyes faded from purple to a pale yellow and then disappeared altogether. His legs, which had trembled beneath him on the cliff staircase like the legs of a newborn foal, now carried him across the room without complaint. On the 7th morning, he stood at the washstand and gripped the edges with both hands, and for the first time, his fingers did not shake. He stared at his reflection in the small looking-glass above the basin. The face that looked back was still too thin, still bearing the marks of what had been done to him, but the eyes were different. The dull, glassy resignation that had settled over them during those weeks at Highcliffe was gone. In its place was something harder and more deliberate. Clara noticed the change as well, though she marked it in practical terms rather than sentimental ones. "You walked to the window and back 6 times this morning without sitting down," she observed from the chair by the door, where she was mending a tear in her traveling dress with a borrowed needle. "Yesterday, it was 4. I was not counting." "I was." Julian almost smiled. He had begun to understand Clara Sterling during these days of enforced proximity, and what he understood was that she operated on information the way a clock operated on springs, constantly gathering, constantly measuring, constantly adjusting her movements according to what the data told her. She observed everything and volunteered nothing that was not immediately useful. It was, he suspected, what made her exceptional at her true profession and simultaneously quite difficult to know as a person. "Tell me something, Miss Sterling," Julian said, turning from the window. "The magistrate who sent you to Highcliffe, does he know where you are now? He knows that I removed myself from the household under emergency circumstances, and that the primary subject is alive and in my protection. I sent a coded message through the Oakhaven postmaster on our 2nd day here. Beyond that, he has no specific knowledge of our location, which is deliberate. The fewer people who possess that information, the fewer people can be pressured to reveal it. And if your magistrate is compromised?" Clara's needle paused for a fraction of a second. "He is not. I have worked with him for 4 years. He is the reason I am in this profession rather than in a workhouse or married to a chandler in Plymouth." She resumed her stitching. "But your instinct to question every link in the chain is correct. It is the instinct that will keep you alive." On the 8th morning, Julian dressed himself without assistance for the first time. He put on the common wool waistcoat and the dark coat and the flat cap that he had grown oddly accustomed to, and he descended the narrow staircase to the boarding-house parlor, where Clara was eating a breakfast of toast and tea. The landlady, a stout woman named Mrs. Penny, who believed them to be siblings recovering from family misfortune, looked up from her knitting with visible pleasure. "Mr. Hale, you look a different man this morning. That chest fever has finally left you, I should say." "I believe it has, Mrs. Penny. Thank you." He sat down across from Clara and ate a full breakfast. Then he pushed his plate aside, folded his hands on the table, and spoke in a low voice that carried no further than Clara's ears. "I am done hiding." Clara set down her teacup. "I know. We have the documents from the courier bag. We have the tonic vials with residue. We have your professional testimony regarding the symptoms and the method of poisoning. What we lack is the original estate deeds, which my brothers will need to alter or destroy if they intend to claim the inheritance legally, and we lack an official venue in which to present our evidence where it cannot be dismissed or buried." "The county court in the provincial capital," Clara said. "The quarterly session begins in 13 days. If the documents are presented before the presiding judge with proper authentication, your brothers cannot suppress them." 13 days. Julian calculated distances and routes in his head. The provincial capital was roughly 70 miles northeast. On horseback, a fit rider could manage it in 2 days. On foot, with a man still rebuilding his strength, it would take considerably longer, and the main roads would be watched. My brothers will have anticipated that I might surface at the county court. They will have people on the major roads. They already do." Clara reached into her sleeve and produced a folded scrap of paper, a handbill, cheaply printed, of the kind posted at coaching inns and market crosses throughout the county. Julian unfolded it and read, "Reward, 20 guineas for information regarding the whereabouts of Mr. Julian Ashworth, missing from his home near Lyme Regis since the night of October 14th. Mr. Ashworth is believed to be suffering from a severe illness affecting his mental faculties and may be traveling in the company of a young woman of criminal disposition. Any person providing information leading to his safe recovery should apply to Mr. Edmund Ashworth at Highcliffe Manor." Julian read it a second time. A young woman of criminal disposition. They were building a story. The confused, mentally incompetent Duke, lured away by a scheming maidservant. If Julian appeared at the county court without overwhelming evidence, Edmund and Lionel could simply point to this handbill and claim he was a sick man manipulated by a criminal. "They are clever," Julian said, folding the paper with deliberate care. "They are desperate," Clara corrected. "Clever men do not leave payment receipts in a courier bag at a public inn. Desperate men do, because they are moving too quickly to cover their traces." Julian stood, his legs held firm beneath him. His shoulders, which had curved inward during those weeks of illness, like a man bracing against a perpetual wind, drew back. "Then we move quicker," he said. "Show me the map." Clara produced a folded ordnance survey map from her canvas bag and spread it across the parlor table. And there, over the remains of breakfast, with Mrs. Penny's knitting needles clicking softly by the fire, a duke and an investigator began planning the dismantling of a conspiracy. They left Oakhaven on the 11th day, traveling northeast along drovers' tracks and field boundaries that kept them well away from the main coaching roads. Clara had purchased 2 things before their departure: a sturdy walking stick for Julian, which he accepted without protest, and a second-hand riding cloak with a deep hood, which she wore pulled low over her face whenever they passed through open ground. The countryside between Oakhaven and the provincial capital was a patchwork of farmland, dense forest, and rolling chalk downs crossed by ancient trackways. Clara had studied the ordnance map thoroughly and plotted a route that followed the least traveled paths, adding roughly 20 miles to the journey, but avoiding every village, toll gate, and posting inn where Edmund's handbills might be displayed. Julian's strength continued to return in steady increments. On the first day of walking, he managed 8 miles before his legs demanded rest. On the second, he covered 11. The walking stick helped, but what helped more was the cold fury that had taken root somewhere deep in his chest and was now providing a quiet, constant fuel that his body seemed to convert directly into forward motion. On the morning of the 3rd day out from Oakhaven, they entered the Great North Road Forest, a dense stretch of ancient woodland that covered the hills between the lowland farms and the mountain pass leading toward the capital. The road through the forest was narrow, rutted, and canopied so thickly by oak and beech that even at midday the light barely reached the ground. It was here, at a crossroads marked by a weathered stone milepost, that Clara stopped walking and held up her hand. "Listen." Julian listened. Through the ordinary sounds of the forest, bird song, the creak of branches, the rustle of small creatures in the undergrowth, he caught something else. Hooves, moving at a trot, coming from the south, perhaps a mile behind them on the road. "How many?" he asked. 3 horses, judging by the rhythm, traveling together. Julian looked at Clara. She was already thinking what he was thinking. The handbill had offered 20 guineas. 3 riders moving together through a forest road, heading in the same direction as 2 fugitives. That was not a coincidence. "We could leave the road and hide in the trees," Clara said. "Let them pass. And if they do not pass, if they are tracking us specifically and know we entered this forest," Julian shook his head, "they will search the tree line on both sides. 3 mounted men can cover ground that 2 people on foot cannot." "Then what do you propose?" Julian looked around. They were standing at the crossroads, where the main forest road intersected with a smaller track leading west toward the coast. 50 yards ahead, the road crossed a narrow stone bridge over a stream that cut through a steep gully. The bridge was old, single arch, barely wide enough for 1 cart, and the gully on either side was choked with fallen timber and dense bracken. An idea formed in his mind with the clarity and precision of a military map being unrolled on a campaign table. Julian had spent 2 years in his youth studying at Sandhurst before his father's death had called him home to assume the ducal title. The training had never left him, even if the occasion to use it had never properly arisen, until now. "Miss Sterling, I need you to trust me for the next 20 minutes. Clara studied his face. Whatever she found there must have satisfied her, because she simply said, "Tell me what to do." Julian moved quickly. He instructed Clara to take their traveling bags and the canvas sack containing the evidence documents to the far side of the bridge, then descend into the gully and conceal herself beneath the stone arch. From there, she would be invisible to anyone on the road above. While she did this, Julian worked on the bridge itself. A large dead elm had fallen across the gully upstream, its trunk resting against the bridge's stone parapet at an angle. Julian braced his shoulder against the trunk and pushed. His muscles burned and his breath came hard, but his body answered him. Weeks of recovery, of proper food and clean water, and the slow purging of poison had rebuilt enough strength for this. The trunk shifted, scraped across the stone, and settled across the road on the far side of the bridge, blocking passage completely. Then he returned to the near side and found what he needed: a farmer's cart track leading off the main road into the trees, with fresh wheel ruts from recent use. Julian took his walking stick and deliberately scored deep, obvious marks in the mud of the cart track, the kind a carriage wheel or a pair of hurrying boots might leave. He broke several low branches along the track's entrance to suggest that something large had recently passed through in haste. Finally, he positioned himself behind a thick oak tree 20 yards from the crossroads, on the opposite side from the bridge, and waited. The riders appeared within 10 minutes. 3 men on brown horses, wearing heavy riding coats and carrying short clubs at their belts. They were not soldiers or constables. Their bearing was too loose, their equipment too mismatched. Hired men, the kind you could recruit from any dockside tavern for a few shillings and the promise of a reward. They reached the crossroads and slowed. The lead rider, a broad man with a red face and a battered tricorn hat, surveyed the intersection. His eyes moved from the main road to the stone bridge, where the fallen elm blocked the way forward, and then to the cart track branching west, where Julian's false trail of broken branches and scored mud led invitingly into the trees. "They have gone for the coast," the red-faced man said to his companions. "Look at these tracks, fresh, heading west." "Could be a farmer's cart," said the second rider, a thinner man with a suspicious expression. "Farmer would not break branches like that. Someone went through here in a hurry, and recently." The lead rider turned his horse toward the cart track. Edmund said the girl knows the coastline. They are making for the sea. The 3 riders urged their horses onto the false trail and disappeared into the forest, heading west, away from the bridge, away from the road to the capital, away from everything that mattered. Julian waited until the sound of hooves had faded completely. Then he crossed to the bridge, leaned over the parapet, and called down softly, "Miss Sterling, they have gone." Clara emerged from beneath the arch, brushing dried leaves from her cloak, the canvas sack of documents clutched securely against her chest. She climbed up to the road and looked in the direction the riders had taken. "The coast road, well, dead ends at the fishing villages near Churmouth," she said. "It will take them most of the day to realize they have been deceived. Then we should not waste the time they have given us." They crossed the bridge, climbed over the fallen elm, and continued northeast through the darkening forest, walking faster now, with the road ahead clear and the sound of pursuing hooves fading into the distance behind them, like a bad dream dissolving in the morning light. They reached Briarford on the 14th day, footsore and weathered but intact. The market town sat in a shallow valley where two rivers met, its streets arranged in a grid pattern that dated back to the medieval wool trade. It was larger than Oakhaven, perhaps 3,000 souls, with a parish church, a covered market hall, a grammar school, and a row of professional chambers along the high street, where solicitors, land agents, and notaries conducted the legal business of the surrounding county. Julian knew this town. He had visited it several times as a boy, accompanying his father to the offices of Mr. Pembroke, the Ashworth family's attorney, whose firm had managed the ducal estate's legal affairs for 2 generations. Pembroke & Sons occupied a handsome brick building near the top of the high street, with brass nameplates on the door and a clerk who sat behind a mahogany counter, sorting documents with the unhurried precision of a man who understood that the law moved at its own pace and resented being rushed. It was Pembroke's archive room that Julian needed to enter. "The original estate deeds are held in Pembroke's office," Julian explained to Clara as they sat in the back pew of the parish church, which was empty on a Thursday afternoon and provided the most private meeting place available. "My father deposited them there 30 years ago. Every Ashworth property, Highcliffe, the London house, the farms in Somerset, the Northern holdings, all documented in a single bound folio with the ducal seal. If my brothers intend to claim the inheritance at the county court, they will need either the original deeds or convincing forgeries." "And you believe they have not yet obtained them from Pembroke?" "Pembroke is an honest man, slow and cautious to a fault, but honest. He would not release the originals without my signature, or a valid court order declaring me deceased or incompetent. My brothers do not yet have either of those things, which is why they were trying to keep me alive long enough to sign under duress, or failing that, to wait until a death could be confirmed and a probate process initiated." Clara considered this. "Then the deeds are still in the archive." "They should be. The question is whether Edmund or Lionel has already arranged to have them stolen or altered. Pembroke's office is well organized, but not well guarded. The clerk leaves at 5 o'clock. Pembroke himself often works late, but he dines at the Red Lion every evening at 7 and does not return until 8:30. That leaves the building empty for approximately 90 minutes. You are suggesting we break into your own attorney's office. I am suggesting we secure the original documents before my brothers can tamper with them. If the originals are safe, any forgeries they produce at the county court can be exposed by comparison. If the originals have already been altered, we need to know that now, rather than discovering it in front of a judge." Clara was quiet for a moment. Through the church windows, the late afternoon light fell across the stone floor in long amber rectangles. A pigeon cooed somewhere in the rafters. "I can manage the lock," she said. "Pembroke's building is Georgian. The rear entrance will have a standard lever tumbler. I have dealt with those before. but I will need you with me. I do not know the layout of the archive or where the folio is kept. I know exactly where it is. Third shelf from the left, second row from the top, behind a set of bound court reports from 1793. My father showed me when I was 16 and told me to remember the location in case anything ever happened to him. Julian paused. I thought he was being theatrical at the time. They spent the remaining hours of daylight preparing. Clara acquired a small leather roll of tools from her traveling bag, items that no scullery maid and no ordinary investigator would typically carry, but which Clara handled with the ease of long familiarity. Julian did not ask where she had learned to pick locks. There were aspects of Clara Sterling's history that she would share when she chose to, and pressing the matter would accomplish nothing. At 7:15, they positioned themselves in the alley behind Pembroke's building. The high street was quiet. Most of the town's business concluded by 6, and the evening trade was concentrated around the taverns and coaching inn at the lower end. A lamplighter moved along the street, touching his long pole to each gas lamp in turn, leaving pools of warm light on the cobblestones. When he passed beyond the building, Clara moved. The rear door yielded in under a minute. The lock made a soft click, and Clara eased the door open onto a narrow corridor that smelled of ink, old paper, and furniture polish. Julian entered behind her and pulled the door shut. The archive room was at the end of the corridor, past Pembroke's private office and a small room where the clerk prepared correspondence. Julian moved through the darkness with careful steps, navigating by memory and by the faint light filtering through the transom windows above each door. The archive room itself had no windows. It was an interior chamber, lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelves, each shelf holding bound folios, deed boxes, and rolled documents tied with red legal ribbon. Julian found the location immediately. Third shelf from the left, second row from the top. He reached behind the bound court reports, and his fingers closed around a heavy leather folio embossed with the Ashworth crest, a falcon above a chevron, with the family motto in Latin beneath. He opened the folio on the reading table in the center of the room, while Clara lit a single taper candle and held it steady. The deeds were all present, every property, every boundary description, every conveyance and entailment documented in the careful legal hand of solicitors dating back to his grandfather's time. The ducal seal, pressed in red wax, was intact on each major document. "They have not been touched," Julian said, the relief evident in his voice. "Then we take them. We cannot simply remove them. If Pembroke discovers the originals missing, he will raise an alarm, and my brothers will know someone has been here. They will accelerate their plans." Julian thought for a moment, then looked at Clara. "We need duplicates. Copies precise enough that a casual inspection by Pembroke's clerk would not detect the substitution." Clara reached into the archive shelves and retrieved a stack of blank legal parchment of the same weight and color as the originals. From Pembroke's clerk's desk, she collected ink, quills, and a stick of red sealing wax. For the next hour, they worked together in silence by candlelight. Julian dictated the key passages from each deed, while Clara transcribed them in a close approximation of legal hand. The copies did not need to be perfect. They needed only to pass a glance from a clerk who saw these folders every day and had no reason to examine them closely. The critical details, property boundaries, entailment clauses, signatures, were rendered with enough accuracy to appear genuine at arm's length. When they finished, Julian placed the duplicates in the folio and returned it to its shelf. The originals went into the canvas sack with the rest of their evidence, wrapped in a cloth to protect them from damp. They left through the rear door. Clara reset the lock behind them. The alley was empty, the lamplighter long gone, and the town settling into its evening quiet. As they walked back toward their lodgings through the darkened streets, Julian held the sack against his chest and felt the weight of generations of Ashworth legacy pressing against his ribs. "If they produce forgeries at the court hearing," he said, "we can place the originals beside them and let the judge see the difference for himself. That is the idea, Your Grace." "Julian," he said, "I think we are well past titles, Miss Sterling." Clara glanced at him sideways. The faintest trace of a smile crossed her face in the lamplight. "Clara, then, but only when we are not in company." The abandoned watermill stood at the edge of a beech forest, 3 miles south of the provincial capital. It was a solid building of gray stone with a moss-covered wheel that had not turned in years, its wooden paddles cracked and warped by seasons of neglect. The mill pond behind it had silted up to a shallow marsh, and the leat, the narrow channel that once directed water from the stream to the wheel, was choked with dead leaves and mud. Clara had identified the mill as their final resting point before entering the capital. They would arrive on the morning of the 20th day, present their evidence at the High Court precinct, and set the legal machinery in motion before Edmund and Lionel could react. That was the plan. It was a good plan. It accounted for timing, for geography, for the legal calendar. What it did not account for was Thomas Bright. Thomas Bright was a tinker who traveled the back roads of the county, mending pots and selling ribbons from a wooden tray hung around his neck. He was also, as Julian and Clara would discover, a man who supplemented his meager income by selling information to anyone willing to pay for it. He had passed them on the road outside Briarford 2 days earlier, tipping his hat with a cheerful grin, and had apparently noted their direction of travel with professional interest. The first sign of trouble came at dusk, on the 17th day, when Clara returned from fetching water at the stream and found boot prints in the soft earth around the mill's perimeter. Fresh prints, multiple sets, made by heavy boots with hobnailed soles, the kind worn by men who expected rough work. She set the water pail down quietly and entered the mill through the side door. "We have visitors," she said. Julian was sitting at a rough wooden table, reviewing the evidence documents by the light of a single candle. He looked up. Clara's expression told him everything her words had not. "How many?" "I count 4 sets of prints, circling the building. They have been here within the last hour, studying the entrances." Clara moved to the window, a narrow slit in the stone wall, and peered through. The forest beyond was darkening rapidly as the sun dropped below the tree line. "They are waiting for full dark." Julian stood. The weeks of recovery, of walking, of proper food and clean water had rebuilt his frame to something approaching its former condition. He was still lean, still carrying the marks of his ordeal, but the wasted invalid who had been carried from his bedchamber was gone. In his place stood a man who had survived betrayal and poison and 100 miles of hard travel, and who was not inclined to be trapped in a building by hired thugs on the eve of his vindication. "The documents," he said, "those are what matter. Everything else is replaceable." Clara was already moving. She gathered the original estate deeds, the intercepted letters, the payment receipts, and the vials of tonic residue, and wrapped them tightly in the oilcloth she had carried since the marshland cottage. The package was compact, roughly the size of a bread loaf, and she secured it with cord and tucked it inside her cloak, against her body where it would stay dry and protected. "There is a water flume beneath the mill," Julian said, crossing to the far wall where the old grinding machinery sat rusted and still. "A stone channel that carried water from the leat, under the building, and out to the mill pond on the other side. The wheel has not operated in years, so the flume should be dry. Should be. I will check. Julian knelt beside the base of the mill wheel's interior housing and pulled away a rotting wooden panel. Behind it, a stone-lined channel, roughly 3 feet wide and 2 feet high, extended into darkness beneath the building's foundation. He reached inside. The stone was damp, but the channel was empty. No standing water, no obstruction that he could feel. It runs under the building and exits through the foundation wall on the pond side, Julian said. 20 feet at most. We can crawl through. Clara knelt beside him and examined the channel entrance. If they have men watching the pond side as well, we emerge directly into them. Which is why we need a distraction on this side first. Julian looked around the mill's interior. The old grinding mechanism dominated the center of the building, a massive oak shaft connected to the water wheel outside, with iron gears and a heavy millstone that had not moved in years. The leat gate, a wooden sluice that controlled the flow of water to the wheel, was operated by a lever mechanism on the wall. The leat itself was blocked with debris, but the stream beyond it was swollen from recent autumn rains. If I open the leat gate and clear enough of the debris, the stream water will flood the channel around the mill, Julian said. The ground on this side is lower than the pond side. The water will flow toward the front of the building, directly into the path anyone approaching from the forest would need to cross. That will buy us minutes at most. Minutes are what we need. They worked quickly and in silence. Julian hauled on the leat lever, which resisted with the stubbornness of years of rust, before giving way with a grinding screech that made them both freeze. Outside, nothing moved. Not yet. Julian used a length of iron bar from the mill's abandoned tools to pry loose the worst of the compacted leaves and silt blocking the leat entrance. Water began to trickle, then flow, then pour through the channel with increasing force, spilling across the mill floor and running out beneath the front door toward the lower ground. Clara was already at the flume entrance. She lowered herself into the stone channel feet first, the oilcloth package pressed tight against her chest, and began pulling herself forward on her elbows. Julian followed, replacing the wooden panel behind him as best he could. The crawl was miserable. The stone was rough and cold against their hands and knees. The darkness was absolute. Julian could hear Clara's breathing ahead of him, steady and controlled, and he matched his own to it. Behind them, muffled by the stone, he heard voices, shouting. The sound of the mill's front door being forced open, followed by a curse as someone stepped into the flooding water. Julian kept crawling. They emerged from the flume into the silted remains of the mill pond, sliding out through a crumbling archway in the foundation wall. The night air hit their faces like a cold cloth. The pond side of the mill was unguarded. The flooding water had drawn every man to the front of the building, exactly as Julian had calculated. Clara pulled herself upright, checked the oilcloth package, and pointed toward the tree line on the far side of the pond. Julian nodded. They crossed the open ground at a crouching run, entered the forest, and did not stop moving until the mill was a mile behind them and the only sound was their own breathing and the distant murmur of the stream continuing its indifferent course through the valley. "Thomas Bright," Clara said between breaths, her jaw tight. "The tinker on the Briarford Road. He sold our location." "You are certain?" "He is the only person who saw our faces and our direction within the last 3 days. When this is over, the magistrate will have a conversation with Mr. Bright about the consequences of selling information that nearly got 2 people finished." Julian leaned against a beech trunk and looked back through the dark trees toward the mill. His heart was hammering, his knees were scraped raw, and his coat was soaked with leet water. The oilcloth package was safe. Clara was safe. The evidence was intact. 3 miles to the capital. They would walk through the night. The provincial capital announced itself long before they reached its walls. First came the smell. Coal smoke, tallow, horse dung, and baking bread tangled together in the early morning air. Then the sound. Church bells ringing the 6 o'clock hour from at least 4 different towers, each slightly out of time with the others, creating a rolling cascade of iron voices across the rooftops. Finally, the sight, a sprawl of brick and stone buildings climbing a hillside above a river crossing, with the cathedral spire rising above everything like a finger pointing toward heaven, and the grand limestone facade of the High Court visible just below it. It was market day. That was fortunate. The roads leading into the capital were clogged with traffic from every direction. Farmers driving carts loaded with turnips and cabbages, drovers herding sheep through the narrow lanes with switches and sharp whistles, pack horses carrying bolts of cloth and crates of pottery, merchants on foot with sample cases, women with baskets of eggs balanced on their hips, a traveling dentist with a painted sign advertising painless extractions, a knife grinder pushing his wheel. The entire commercial life of the county was funneling through 4 gates in the old town walls, and 2 more people joining the stream attracted no attention whatsoever. Julian and Clara had spent the last hours of darkness preparing their disguises. Julian wore a rough woolen coat dusted with fibers that Clara had plucked from a sheep fence along the road, a wide-brimmed felt hat pulled low, and a canvas sample bag slung across his shoulder that contained nothing except a few handfuls of raw fleece collected from hedgerows. Clara wore her brown traveling dress with a wool shawl and carried a ledger book, actually her own investigation notes with a false cover, under her arm. To any casual observer, they were exactly what they appeared to be. A pair of wool merchants arriving for market day, unremarkable among hundreds of similar figures streaming through the gates. They passed through the east gate without challenge. The constable station there was occupied with a carter whose axle had cracked in the gateway, blocking traffic in both directions, and he waved the foot traffic through with an impatient gesture that did not include looking at anyone's face. Inside the walls, the capital was dense and bustling. The streets were cobbled and narrow, lined with shops whose upper stories jutted outward until they nearly touched across the lane. Signboards hung from iron brackets above doorways, a golden boot for the cobbler, a mortar and pestle for the apothecary, a pair of shears for the tailor. The market square occupied the center of the town, already filling with stall holders, erecting canvas canopies, and arranging their goods on wooden trestles. Julian had not visited this city in over 2 years. The last occasion had been a dinner at the Assizes with his father's old associates, a long table of port wine and legal gossip that he had found tedious at the time and would now give a great deal to repeat. He navigated from memory, leading Clara through a series of side streets that avoided the market square and brought them to the quieter precincts near the cathedral, where the legal and administrative buildings stood in a row of dignified Georgian facades. The High Court precinct occupied 3 connected buildings behind an iron railing, with a porter's lodge at the gate and a courtyard where barristers in black gowns walked between chambers carrying bundles of documents tied with pink legal tape. The magistrate court, where lesser judicial business was conducted, occupied the building on the left. The chief bailiff's name is Garrick, Julian said, stopping beneath the arched entrance to a bookseller's shop, across the street from the precinct gate. Arthur Garrick. He served with my father on the county bench for 12 years before my father passed. He is honest, he is thorough, and he despises corruption with the kind of personal intensity that only a man who has spent 30 years watching people attempt it can sustain. You trust him. My father trusted him, which is a higher recommendation. The last time I saw Garrick was at my father's funeral. He gripped my hand and told me that if I ever needed anything at all, I should come to him directly and not through intermediaries. I thought it was the kind of thing people say at funerals. I am rather hoping he meant it. Clara adjusted her shawl and studied the precinct entrance. We cannot simply walk in and announce that the Duke of Ashworth would like to see the chief bailiff. Your brother's handbill described you as mentally incompetent and me as a criminal. If the wrong person recognizes either of us before we reach Garrick, we could be detained on Edmund's complaint before we speak a single word of evidence. Then we do not announce ourselves. Garrick takes his morning tea in his office at 8:30. He has done so for as long as anyone can remember. His office is on the first floor, second door on the left past the main staircase. If we enter through the clerk's entrance on the side of the building, which will be busy with junior staff arriving for the day, we can reach his office without passing through the public areas. You know this building well. I spent several afternoons hiding in its corridors while my father conducted business. There are advantages to a misspent youth. At 8:20, they crossed the street and entered the precinct through the side entrance. Clara's instinct for moving through institutional buildings without attracting attention served them well. She walked with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged, her ledger book held visibly under her arm, like a clerk delivering morning correspondence. Julian matched her pace, keeping his head tilted slightly downward beneath the brim of his hat. The corridor was busy with the morning's administrative traffic. Clerks carrying stacks of paper, a barrister arguing with his pupil about the wording of a brief, a cleaning woman mopping the stone floor near the staircase, who stepped aside for them without looking up. They climbed the stairs. Second door on the left. Julian knocked. "Enter," said a voice from inside, deep, slightly hoarse, carrying the weight of decades spent speaking in courtrooms. Julian opened the door. The office was modest. A desk buried under papers, shelves lined with law reports, a window overlooking the courtyard, and a coal fire burning in a small grate. Behind the desk sat Arthur Garrick, chief bailiff of the magistrate court, a man of 63 years, with white side whiskers, steel-rimmed spectacles, and the steady, watchful eyes of someone who had heard every possible lie and retained an unfashionable belief in the truth. Garrick looked up from his tea. His gaze moved from Julian's face to Clara's and back again. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he set down his cup, removed his spectacles, and spoke in a voice that was remarkably steady for a man who was looking at someone the entire county believed to be finished. "Julian Ashworth, sit down, son, and tell me everything." Julian sat. Clara placed the oilcloth package on the desk and began unwrapping it. The original estate deeds, the intercepted letters, the payment receipts in Dr. Hartwell's handwriting, the glass vials with their thin residue of brownish poison. Garrick examined each item in turn, handling them with the care of a man who understood the difference between papers and evidence. He read the letters twice. He held one of the vials to the window light and studied the residue. He compared the payment dates against a calendar on his wall. When he finished, he placed his spectacles back on his nose and looked at Julian with an expression that contained equal measures of anger and resolve. "I will have warrants drawn before noon," he said. "Your brothers and their physician will be arrested at the county court tomorrow morning, in front of every person who matters in this county, and I will personally ensure that they do not leave that courtroom as free men." He reached across the desk and gripped Julian's hand. The same grip from the funeral, 5 years ago, tighter now, and carrying the full authority of his office behind it. "Your father would be proud of you, lad. Now let us finish this." The Grand County Hall was the finest building in the provincial capital, and it knew it. Built 40 years earlier from pale Bath stone, it occupied the highest ground in the city center, with a columned portico, tall arched windows, and a carved coat of arms above the main entrance that depicted the county's symbols: a stag, a wheat sheaf, and a Latin motto about justice that most people walking beneath it never bothered to read. Inside, the main courtroom was a cavernous space with dark oak paneling, tiered public galleries on 3 sides, and a raised judicial bench at the far end where the presiding judge sat beneath a portrait of the king. On the morning of the 21st day since Julian's escape from Highcliffe Manor, this courtroom was full. The quarterly county session attracted a regular audience of solicitors, clerks, land agents, and interested citizens who came to observe the grinding machinery of property law and local governance. Today's docket included 3 boundary disputes, a contested tenancy, and, listed as the final item of the morning, a petition for the legal declaration of death and subsequent transfer of estates in the matter of Julian Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth, believed deceased. Julian watched the proceedings from a small anteroom behind the courtroom, where Garrick had installed him and Clara before dawn. The door was guarded by 2 of Garrick's own bailiffs, men who answered to the chief bailiff personally, and whose loyalty was beyond the reach of Edmund Ashworth's purse. Through a narrow gap in the door, Julian could see the courtroom filling with its morning crowd, and there, in the front row of the petitioner's bench, sat his brothers. Edmund was the elder of the 2, 30 years old, with the Ashworth jaw and a carefully groomed appearance that projected respectability like a coat of varnish over cheap wood. He wore a dark blue frock coat with brass buttons, a silk cravat, and an expression of solemn gravity that Julian recognized as entirely manufactured. Edmund had practiced that expression in the mirror since boyhood, the look of a man burdened by unfortunate circumstances, bearing up nobly under the weight of duty. Beside him sat Lionel, 27, thinner and more restless, with quick darting eyes that moved constantly around the room as though cataloging potential threats. Lionel had always been the nervous one, the planner, the one who lay awake calculating odds and possibilities, while Edmund provided the outward confidence. Together, they formed a single functioning conspirator, Edmund the face, Lionel the mind, and behind them both, seated with the quiet composure of a man who believed himself untouchable, was Dr. Hartwell. The physician was 55, gray-haired, with the well-fed appearance of someone who had profited handsomely from his profession and intended to continue doing so. He carried a leather medical case on his lap and wore a black coat that gave him the appearance of respectability. Julian looked at that face, the face that had leaned over his bed each evening with a concerned frown while pouring measured arsenic into a cup of honeyed tonic, and felt something cold and precise settle into his chest like a key turning in a lock. The presiding judge entered, the Honorable Mr. Justice Whitmore, a lean man of 70, with a powdered wig and a reputation for impatience with poorly prepared cases. The courtroom rose, then sat. The morning's business commenced. Julian waded through the boundary disputes. He waded through the contested tenancy. He listened to the drone of legal argument, and the shuffling of papers, and the occasional sharp interjection from Justice Whitmore, who did not tolerate vagueness, and said so frequently. Clara stood beside him in the anteroom, dressed in a plain dark gown that Garrick had provided, her hair pinned neatly, the oilcloth package of evidence resting on a table behind her, alongside the original estate deeds. At 11:30, the clerk of the court called the final matter of the morning. The petition of Mr. Edmund Ashworth and Mr. Lionel Ashworth in the matter of the estate of Julian Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth. The petitioners seek a declaration of presumed death and the transfer of all ducal properties and entitlements to the surviving male heirs. Edmund rose. His solicitor, the Dorchester man, not Pembroke, stood beside him with a sheaf of papers. Lionel remained seated, his eyes fixed on the judge. The solicitor began his presentation. Julian Ashworth had been missing for 21 days. Despite extensive search efforts, no trace of him had been found. The Duke had been suffering from a severe wasting illness. Here Dr. Hartwell nodded gravely from his seat, and it was the considered medical opinion that he could not have survived more than a few days without the physician's care. The petition was supported by sworn statements from the household guards, from Dr. Hartwell, and from 2 servants at Highcliffe Manor, all attesting to the Duke's deteriorated condition at the time of his disappearance. The solicitor then produced a set of estate documents, freshly prepared copies of the property deeds, showing the Ashworth estates divided between Edmund and Lionel in equal shares, with no provision for the charitable trust that Julian had intended to establish. The solicitor presented these to the clerk for submission to the judge. Justice Whitmore examined the documents through a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. He asked several questions about the search efforts, the medical evidence, and the legal basis for presumed death after so short a period. Edmund answered each one with practiced calm, his voice carrying the appropriate mixture of grief and resignation. It was a convincing performance. Julian acknowledged that privately. His brother had prepared thoroughly, anticipated the judge's concerns, and constructed a narrative that held together under scrutiny. If Julian had actually been dead, it might well have succeeded. Julian turned to Clara. She met his eyes and gave a single nod. He straightened his coat, not the gardener's overcoat or the wool merchant's rough jacket, but a proper gentleman's frock coat of dark charcoal gray that Garrick had arranged to be delivered that morning, along with a clean linen shirt, a properly tied cravat, polished boots, and a waistcoat bearing the Ashworth crest, embroidered in silver thread. For the first time in 21 days, Julian looked exactly like what he was. Garrick opened the courtroom doors from inside. The heavy oak panels swung wide, and the sound drew every eye in the chamber. Julian walked through. The effect was immediate and devastating. Edmund's composure cracked like thin ice over a deep pond. His mouth opened, closed, and opened again. Lionel went rigid in his seat, the color draining from his face so rapidly that he appeared to age 10 years in the space of a breath. Dr. Hartwell's medical case slid from his lap and struck the floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the silent courtroom. The public gallery erupted in murmurs. Justice Whitmore's gavel came down twice. Julian walked the full length of the courtroom at a measured pace, flanked by Clara on his left and 2 of Garrick's bailiffs on his right. He stopped before the judicial bench, bowed to the judge, and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of that vast paneled room. "My Lord Justice, I am Julian Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth. I am, as you can observe, very much alive, and I have evidence to present to this court regarding the circumstances of my disappearance and the true nature of the petition you have just heard." Justice Whitmore removed his reading glasses and studied Julian for a long, silent moment. Then he turned his gaze to Edmund, who had the expression of a man watching the ground open beneath his feet. "It would appear, Mr. Ashworth," the judge said dryly, "that reports of your brother's death have been considerably exaggerated. I believe the court will hear this evidence with great interest. He looked at the clerk. Clear the remainder of the docket. This matter will have my full attention. Clara stepped forward, opened the oilcloth package, and began to read. The reading took 47 minutes. Clara presented each piece of evidence in sequence, beginning with the glass vials containing the residue of Dr. Hartwell's poison tonics, proceeding through the intercepted letters detailing the division of the estates, the payment receipts in the physician's handwriting, and finally, the original estate deeds placed side by side with the forged copies that Edmund's solicitor had submitted to the court moments earlier. The courtroom listened in absolute silence. The public galleries, which had buzzed with whispered speculation when Julian first appeared, fell still as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Justice Whitmore examined each document personally, holding the originals and forgeries together under the light from the tall arched windows, tracing the discrepancies with his finger, a signature that slanted differently here, a seal impression that was fractionally too shallow there, a date that had been altered with ink of a slightly different shade. When Clara finished, Justice Whitmore turned to Edmund. "Mr. Ashworth, do you wish to respond to this evidence?" Edmund stood. For a moment, Julian thought his brother might attempt one final performance. One last appeal to respectability, one more manufactured expression of bewildered innocence. But something had broken behind Edmund's eyes during those 47 minutes. The careful facade, maintained for months through planning and bribery and the slow poisoning of his own brother, had collapsed under the weight of its own documentation. Edmund opened his mouth, closed it, and sat down, without speaking a word. Lionel did not even attempt to rise. Dr. Hartwell, however, made one last effort. He stood from his seat and addressed the bench in the calm, measured tone of a medical professional accustomed to being believed. "My Lord Justice, the tonic I administered to His Grace was a standard preparation of valerian and restorative herbs, prescribed for his wasting condition. The allegations of poisoning are the fabrications of a disturbed young woman who infiltrated the household under false pretenses. I am a physician of 28 years' standing, and I categorically deny—" "Dr. Hartwell." Justice Whitmore's voice cut through the physician's speech like a blade through paper. "The payment receipts before me are written in your own hand. They are dated to correspond precisely with the period of the Duke's decline. They are addressed to his brothers, who are seated beside you, and who have just attempted to claim his estate by presenting forged documents to this court." The judge removed his glasses and set them on the bench. "You may save your denials for your own trial. Chief Bailiff, execute the warrants." Garrick stepped forward. His bailiffs moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had performed this duty many times and understood that dignity and firmness were equally required. Edmund was escorted from the courtroom first, his wrists bound before him with leather straps, his head bowed. Lionel followed, trembling visibly, his darting eyes finally fixed on the floor. Dr. Hartwell went last, still protesting in a voice that grew progressively less confident as he was guided through the doors and into the corridor beyond, where a closed carriage waited to transport them to the county jail. The courtroom remained full for several minutes after the arrests, the assembled crowd processing what they had witnessed. Justice Whitmore recorded his findings. The petition for presumed death was dismissed, the forged documents were seized as evidence, and the original estate deeds were authenticated and returned to the possession of Julian Ashworth, 5th Duke of Ashworth, whose identity and competence were confirmed before the court without reservation. Julian stood before the bench as the judge completed his notes. Clara stood beside him, her hands folded, her expression composed. She had not looked at the brothers as they were led away. Her attention had remained fixed on the documents, on the evidence, on the judicial record. The investigator in her understood that the arrest was a single step in a longer process, and that the real work, the trial, the testimony, the formal dismantling of the conspiracy, still lay ahead. But the immediate danger was over. The plot had been exposed in the most public venue available, before a judge whose integrity was beyond question, with evidence so thoroughly documented that no solicitor in England could construct a credible defense against it. 3 days later, Julian returned to Highcliffe Manor. The coastal estate looked the same as it had on the night he had fled. The chalk cliffs, the grey stone walls, the long windows facing the sea. The household staff lined the entrance hall as his carriage pulled up to the front door, and the expressions on their faces ranged from astonishment to tearful relief to, in 1 or 2 cases, visible anxiety about their own positions. Julian noted each face and filed each reaction away for later consideration. The loyal would be rewarded. The complicit would be dismissed. The merely frightened would be given the opportunity to prove themselves. Reynolds and Thatcher, the 2 guards who had accepted 40 guineas each to ensure their master's death, had been arrested the previous day at a tavern in Lyme Regis, where they had been spending their earnings with the cheerful abandon of men who believed the matter settled. On the 24th day, Julian sat in the great library of Highcliffe Manor, a long, handsome room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a marble fireplace, and tall windows that overlooked the gardens, and beyond them, the sea. This was the room where his father had taught him to read, where his grandfather had signed the documents that expanded the estate, where 4 generations of Ashworth decisions had been made in the quiet company of 10,000 leather-bound volumes. Mr. Pembroke had arrived that morning from Briarford, carrying the will that Julian had intended to sign before his brother's scheme had intervened. The solicitor was a small, precise man who had been visibly shaken by the events of the past 3 weeks, but who had recovered his professional composure with admirable speed. He laid the document on the library desk, placed a pen beside it, and stepped back. Julian read the will carefully, though he knew its contents by heart. The bulk of the Ashworth estates would remain intact, managed for the benefit of the tenants and the local communities that depended upon them. A significant portion of the agricultural lands would be converted into a public trust, open to the county for use as commons, with revenues directed toward the maintenance of local schools and almshouses. The London townhouse would be retained. The northern properties would be managed by appointed stewards, answerable to the Trust's Board of Governors. Julian signed his name at the bottom of each page. Pembroke witnessed. The wax seal was applied, the Ashworth falcon above the chevron pressed firmly into red wax that would hold the impression for generations. When the legal business was concluded and Pembroke had departed with the executed documents secured in his case, Julian remained in the library. Clara stood by the window, looking out at the sea. She had changed from the plain gown she had worn at the court hearing into a dress of dark green wool, simple, well-fitted, appropriate for a woman whose station was about to change considerably. "I have a proposal for you, Clara," Julian said from the desk. She turned from the window. "This estate requires a chief steward and administrator. Someone who can manage the properties, oversee the trust, handle the tenants and the accounts, and the 1,000 daily decisions that keep an enterprise of this size functioning. The position demands intelligence, integrity, organizational ability, and a willingness to challenge me directly when I am wrong." Julian leaned back in his chair. I have interviewed the available candidates extensively over the past 3 weeks, under conditions that I believe constitute a thorough evaluation of character. There is one applicant who meets every requirement.